Hello, everybody. Hello, Rebecca. Great to
Hi,
be
Rana.
here, sharing the stage with you. So, welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, rather probably good afternoon, I guess. Welcome to the rendezvous, the July rendezvous, connecting the dots, renewables for sustainable development.
I am about to be joined on the stage by Rana Adib, Director of REN21, for the formal welcome of the session today. We're going to be having a really interactive discussion. Hopefully you've had a chance already to get to know each other and to find out a little bit more about each other. And so we've got an exciting agenda for you. We've got Claire Nicholas from the World Bank. We've got Molin Gregal from the Human Project. We were hoping to have Natasha Allen from the Mi Panyar project, but unfortunately there is a major power outage there. But Vibhu from the REN21 team is hopefully going to be talking through a bit her slides and just giving a bit of a summary of input. And then we're going to go into a fantastic empty chair Q&A session. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but this is where we get really interactive and have the chance to really collaborate and discuss. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Rana to turn her camera and her microphone on for the formal welcome for today's session. So over to you, Rana.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So welcome everybody. I hope that you had a great exchange at your tables, because the rendezvous is not only about talking and listening, but it's about talking to each other and connecting. And we're very delighted to see so many new faces in this event. So today we have a rendezvous under the topic, which is connecting the dots, renewables for sustainable development. I think during the last couple of months in particular, there was a lot about lots of the discussion about renewable energy were very much happening in the climate context. But the reality is energy is everywhere, and energy is a key driver for main societal and economic activities. And especially when we're looking into developing emerging economies, we clearly see that climate might actually not always be the key driver here for positioning renewable energy. And this event today is about really exploring the space, seeing how renewable energy plays a role in the context of energy for growth and energy for development, and connecting the dots, because the reality also is that often when we're looking at the development ecosystem, I guess, and the discussions, renewable energy is very much discussed in the energy access discussion, so rather the tier 1 discussion about basic lighting, basic energy access. But actually it is much more, and very often renewable energy can actually also play a role, and it is an opportunity to build up energy infrastructure that is different than a fossil fuel-based infrastructure, but creates opportunities. I think there's always this terminology of what are the opportunities of leapfrogging. So I think, why are we doing this from REN21 side? We're clearly doing this for making the invisible visible, and bringing information, sharing insights, but also having really a confrontation, I guess, or an exchange about the perspectives. Because often it's not about not understanding, it's just not about seeing. There are blind spots. And I think this is very much where we feel that looking at those blind spots, bringing different perspectives together, bringing the ecosystem together, is a clear opportunity to raise the awareness about let's say, energy consuming sector, whether it is agriculture, health, industry, education, in the context of city development, etc., to show the role of renewable energy and raise awareness here, how important and what opportunities exist. But it's also important to accelerate the transition to renewable energy by better understanding the concern there, the agenda, the needs, and this is actually what we will discuss today. So So I think maybe one other aspect I would like to underline, we clearly see today, and the last Renewables Global States report we published in June shows it, that it is important to move to renewable energy, but it is also important, and it is even more important, to move out of fossil fuel. And obviously, this is something which is sometimes quite challenging for developing emerging economies, especially but there is a major opportunity here, which we'd also like to explore. It is about not spending money on fossil fuel that is being imported, but really building a local energy and creating local jobs and an industry. So I think that's it from my side. As a convening agent, we're very happy to bring people together and trigger new thinking. And I'm very happy that Rebecca is leading us through this to help us tap into our different brains and activate them. And I look very much forward to the great lightning talks of our speakers, where we'll have the opportunity to have some perspectives to kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rana, for setting the scene for today's session. So for those of you who might have joined a couple of minutes late, just to remind you, this is going to be a highly interactive dialogue today. And just in case, if you start during the speakers that are coming up in a minute, start having questions, start having some insights, please use the Q&A button on the right to put your questions in. You can upvote, but also on the left, if you've got some insights, maybe if you just joined, say hello to everyone. Where are you from? It's fantastic to see so many new faces and lots of old faces as well. So really, really delighted to see just the range and different nationalities, etc., joining us today. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is invite Claire Nicholas from the World Bank to join us on stage. Claire, if you'd like to turn your camera and your microphone on. And Claire is going to give us the first of today. And once we've had the talks, then we're going to go into a panel discussion. So welcome, Claire. Fantastic you could join us today. I'm so pleased. And I'm just going to turn my camera off and hand over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rebecca. And thank you, Rana, to give me the opportunity to come and topics. I'm going to talk today about the Sustainable Renewable Risk Mitigation Initiative, which is very relevant to today's discussion. It's an initiative developed with other partners, ISA, AFD, IRENA, which aims at developing RE programs in developing countries, leveraging private investments while maximizing socioeconomic benefits. Let me try. Okay. So I guess you will, as Rana mentioned previously, you very well know the global context, particularly the climate change context. According to IEA, more than 600 gigawatt of new PV and 300 gigawatt of new wind plants will need to be built in the next 5 years in developing and emerging economies to ensure that we will be on track to meet the Paris Agreement and to tackle the climate change challenge. But apart from climate change, RE deployment can play a very large role in developing economies because it is a least cost solution in many developing economies, particularly sub-Saharan economies. And so it could reduce the cost of electricity generation. It can also increase energy security and energy access by helping to diversify the energy mix. And because it's a modular source of energy, and it has very short construction timeline, and it's particularly true for for solar PV. It can answer fast-growing demand and remote demand. And the fourth or fifth point, which is very important and very relevant to today's discussion, is that the socio-economic impacts RE development can have on fostering industrial and local development, as well as women empowerment, are really concrete and could be a game changer. So given all those like very incredible benefits that RE could have, we were wondering why the RE pipeline was so small in developing economies. And so 2 years ago, like almost 3 years ago now, we conducted a market sounding with private developers to understand why the RE pipeline was so small. And in fact, there are challenges hindering the development of this pipeline. First, a very weak enabling environment in many countries, with a lack of clear regulation, for example. The second very important point is that there is often a lack of open and transparent procurement process in those countries, a lack of access to risk mitigation coverage, and finally, real and perceived grid integration issues for VRE technologies. And the result is that RE projects are developed with a piecemeal approach, like very project by project, and we don't see a bankable and sustainable pipeline of projects in developing in emerging economies for the private sector. So the solution that we came up with is like SRMI. So the idea is really to have an integrated approach, trying to tackle at the same time these four main challenges. So the solution is first like to provide technical assistance to improve the enabling environment. So helping countries to work on generation and transmission plans, as well as VRE integration in their grid, to ensure that the targets that they will have, that they will be able to disclose targets to the private sector for 2025, 2030, saying, okay, we aim to have like 600 megawatts of PV and maybe 200 megawatt of CSP developed, and so on. The second bucket is on the robust procurement. So it's also, the idea is also to provide support, technical assistance for example, transaction advisory, feasibility study, environment and social instruments, and so on. And the third bucket is also a very important one and relates to critical public investments. So here the idea is to support the countries invest in public infrastructure that is necessary to integrate VRE. So this one is a very technical one, like building transmission lines, more substation, upgrading substation, solar and wind park infrastructure, maybe storage, in some cases, storage solutions. And finally, the fourth bucket is on the risk mitigation coverage and instruments, providing for example, guarantees for IPPs in countries where at the moment guarantees are not available, to ensure that the private sector will come in an easier way. And so the idea is to do all that, so really ensure that we will see our RE pipeline being developed in emerging economies, but we don't want just the RE pipeline to exist, but to ensure that the socioeconomic benefits will be maximized. And it's not obvious that because you now have a pipeline that you have like a direct impact. And so there are no challenges to the deployment in fact of socioeconomic benefits. And those challenges are of like three orders. First, on the maximization of the participation of the country to the RE value chain. There are obstacles like, for example, the lack of visibility of the local opportunities for international bidders. There are very tight time frame for the tenders, so international bidders don't always have the time to find a local partner to develop their projects. And they often have like pre-approved list of suppliers. It's costly to make local assessments of capacity. And on the other side, for local players, since there are no like clear pipeline and clear roadmaps developed by governments, they don't necessarily have a good knowledge of their positioning on the RE value chain, and they don't know what is coming, so they don't have the visibility to be able to invest in production units. Then there is a risk of not maximizing the local development, and it's mostly due to the lack of coordination between the public party, the private party, and the local communities, and because of the lack of involvement or limited involvement of local communities in the decision-making process. And the third bucket is on gender equality and gender equality outcomes, because large-scale solar and wind projects are often benefits men more than women. So if we are not really cautious and we don't put in place mitigation measures, we can increase the gender gap. So really, like, the idea of SRMI is to work on the development of a RE pipeline while taking into account these issues. And before I finish my lightning talk, I would like to give you the example of Botswana. So we're currently working with Botswana on their RE roadmaps, and they are planning to develop in the coming 7 years a new CSP plant, a new PV utility scale plant, and a wind farm. And we just conducted, with them, obviously, an analysis showing that with some small and not costly measures, like working on the local content regulation, ensuring that there will be capacity building and training for miners, for example, because the Botswana has a very large mining industry. So technical people, by doing very kind of small things, small targeted things, they could increase their participation to the Botswana participation to the PV value chain by 10%, and I think to the CSP and wind value chain by 15%, leading overall to an increase of jobs, of local jobs created by those future projects, those projects to come, from more than 25%. So more than 25% increase in jobs created. So really working with the countries on the socioeconomic aspects of RE projects is something that should lead to tremendous results, and that is completely, totally doable and not very costly to do. Thank you, Rana and Rebecca. I'm done with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a very insightful presentation. Coming through in the Q&A, so we're going to hold those, Claire, for a moment. And what I would like to do is now invite Molin Gragau from the Human Project to the stage. So Molin, if you'd like to turn your camera and your microphone on. Speaking of microphones, I know I've got a small issue with mine. Apologies if I'm sounding a bit tinny, but you hopefully will be able to hear me nonetheless. Hello, Molin, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much, Rebecca.
Fantastic. Molin, are you there? You're there, I can see you, fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to you now, and we will join you again in a minute when you've wrapped up your presentation. Over to you, Molin. Okay, I think we're having a few glitches here on the tech front. We always like to be very ambitious, pushing the edge of tech where we can. So what I'm going to suggest is that we wait just 1 minute for Molin to turn her camera off, hopefully, and then she will be able to, we'll just have the audio to her talking through her slides, which hopefully won't be an issue. I'm just going to ask the production team if in the meantime they could pull up Molin's slides for us while we wait for Molin to join the stage. And maybe this is the time also to take a moment to reflect on Claire's presentation and put some of the questions into the Q&A function. I can see there's quite a few coming through already. If you want to take a moment to read those that are already there, I can see that a few of you have been upvoting the questions as well, which is fantastic. I'm going to just see, I'm just checking, it looks like Molin will hopefully be rejoining us in a minute. If not, what I'm going to do is ask Claire maybe to turn up. Here she is, she's back again. Hello, Molin.
Sorry. We just had a power cut. I'm so sorry.
We're on to round two. Let's hope this time, second time lucky.
Yeah.
With that in mind, I don't know if you want to keep your camera on or not, but the team have got your slides.
I think
so
hopefully.
Fantastic. So I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to let you run with it. Over to you, Molly.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So will you share my presentation for me, please? Rebecca?
Oh, yeah, I'm just checking. The team should be, yep, it's loading now. So now over to you.
So as Rebecca has said, my name is Molin Grasher. I'm the Energy for Energy Innovation Network. Instead, I'm quite pleased to talk to you today about renewable development with specific focus to the question of energy access. So let's get to it. So as spoken quite well, we find that in the current of global warming and climate change, and these have been identified as major challenges to our society. Hence, the reason why we even have the Sustainable Development Goals, where in specifically we are more interested. The United Nations has made it quite clear that we want to be able to sort of like transition to sustainable and clean energy at least by 2030, and one reason for this is we want to be able to not only to be able to have more sustainable sources of energy that will be able to allow us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to allow us to become a more clean energy society. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the main crux of my presentation today, where I'll focus on beyond energy access and relate to you some of my on-the-ground experiences, because prior to joining the renewable energy communities, I've been mostly focused in drafting renewable energy policies, and there's always policy making sector that most policymakers and most policy within a bubble, most do not go outside to find out what's happening on the ground. And to find that the main conversation that we've had over the years is by transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, very great economic, environmental, and economic that would allow our society to progress. And you find that the key message within this particular space has been that if we can be able to transition from fossil fuels, coal or oil, energy sources like biofuels and all that, then we'll be able to optimize efficiencies and limit emissions. But then the question is, when we are having this conversation, what are the challenges that will limit this transition from fossil fuels to renewable and clean energy technologies? And you find that in that space, we have to consider demographic, social, and economic and technological trends that sort of like hinder this progress. And a good example of this I'll give you is my country, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a highland, sort of speak, country, a country within a higher sea level, higher altitude sea level. So you find that the various regional states are built differently. For instance, if you go to a state like Afar, it's much more, it experiences more sunshine as opposed to, like, let's say Tigray. So for instance, when the government comes up with policies and says, okay, we are going to have a hydroelectric power for all, has it considered the peculiar dynamics of, or is it just a one size fits all? And you find in most cases that are made because the sort of driving force that is there and get people to stop using renewable energy technologies, which brings me to my next, having this conversation. What are the considerations that you have to pay attention to when you're coming up, when you're from fossil fuels to renewable energy technology? What are the key? Because you'll find of the country's resources out just to consider such that there is not a one size fits all. For instance, you have to take into account the local renewable resources, and resources, you're not just focusing on, let's say, the natural resources, you're focusing as well on the human capital. A good example would be, I'll use the example of Kenya, where in 2018, at that time, the of the country had issued a directive that the government has, they actually issued a 90-day ban on charcoal, such that people are not supposed to cut trees as a way to to cut trees for fuel consumption. So the directive was meant to protect the forest coverage of the country. But you see, the problem with that policy directive was that there were no considerations that had been simply just came into the media, came onto the media, because it identified this particular problem, and we need a knee-jerk reaction. And if we're telling people to stop, for instance, cutting down trees, the sources, what are these sources? There were no considerations. Still continue to do illegal logging, presenting a much better solution, and you're not educating us why we need we're talking about how we're not just giving you energy access, but how do we get the public, the stakeholders invested in this conversation, so that whatever policy or directives or laws that we put in place are much more relevant, not only in as much as taking care of the economic, the environmental, and the developmental issues, but it's a sort of like a cross-sectoral approach to solving the situation that we are facing. Which brings me to the other aspect, which is, what are the goals that we could sort of consider when you're coming up with policy? Because you'll notice that it's very good and it's all beautiful when we craft policy talking about, so we want to transition and we want to come up with renewable energy technology so that we increase access to people who are living in the rural areas, or people who do not have, we sort of like bring these people to the national grid. But what other conversations should we have? This is it just, it's not, because it's not sufficient to just say what about energy security? Because in the example that I've given, for instance, of the where people are being prohibited from, they were not presented with and are more affordable. You find that you say charcoal and coal in general are environment, but they do provide energy security for areas of people who cannot afford to purchase things like that. So how then do we come up with the policy when we have efficiency? We not only have these resources, these are the sort of like we talk about them, but we don't really come up with concrete solutions that are more applicable on the ground. So, and those are some of the barriers that we find sort of like limit access to and implementation of renewable energy technologies within the rural areas, within the grassroots level. So well, there's so many benefits that have been loaded, that have been saved. We're having this conversation such that when we are having renewables, then it will create, there'll be job creation, we'll have more development within the country. But then the question is, how much investment is being put into the development of these technologies? And granted, you'll find that when you're having the conversation of renewable energy or renewables in general, we must differentiate between developing countries and developed countries, because you find the challenges of developed countries are quite different to those of developing countries. And more high on the priority list of many governments is healthcare, is food security, is national security. So energy is, the focus is on the traditional modes of energy, such as oil, the fossil fuels and all that. So in many countries, the few that I've worked in, a huge directed to fossil fuels, and maybe less than 10% to. There are so many other things that are taken into play, such that, for instance, the production cost of renewable energy technologies, they'll create jobs, but then what is the cost? What is the cost of distributing them? And then again, once you address the issue of cost, then you'll address the market share, because the cost of renewables is to market share and policy interventions, because if there's not much of them within the market, then the prices go up. So you find that when we are developing policy, then we have to focus on this issue, the production cost, the market share, and the policy. And in many cases, for instance, in the countries I've worked in, such as in South Africa, in Uganda, and in Kenya, the suggestion that we've always had is for government to enter into power purchase agreements with the private sector, the other stakeholders in the private sectors, and other people who want to develop that space. But the problem with that is there's never a concrete sort of like agreement that is put in stone, because at one point or the other, it's most likely the government ends up breaching the power purchase agreement. And this has been the case, for instance, for the wind farming eastern part of Kenya. And we had a huge aspect of it where there was a good initiative, renewable energy, wind energy for that particular region. Failure to agree on the terms of that agreement has sort of like left in disarray 5-6 years on. So factors that we have to consider. And also when you're talking about also, is it good to have tariff, feed-in tariffs, auction prices, when you're talking about how to private sectors on board? Advantages, for instance, of having a feed-in tariff policy as a way to encourage investment in this particular sector. So those are just some of the questions that I'd like to leave you with. And thank you so much for listening to me. And I hand it over to you, Rebecca.
For a very, again, really interesting presentation. And I can see like the Q&A is lighting up. I'm a bit worried we're not going to get to all those questions and answers in the time that we've got, but it's good to have so many. So at this point, Molin, I'm going to say thank you very much. We'll speak to you in a bit when we do the Q&A, and I'm going to ask Vibhu to join us on the stage. As I mentioned earlier, our third speaker, Natasha Allen, unfortunately has had a major power outage and is not able to join today. So instead, we've got the wonderful, fantastic Vibhu that many of you know from RENdez-vous. And I just want to over to you. I think what you're going to do is just walk around the slides, some high-level comments before we regroup.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. I'm clearly not Natasha Allen, and I wish I was, because I think she has many interesting things to share. This also means that I obviously am not going to be able to do justice to her fantastic presentation or her work, but I nonetheless wanted to share some slides. Just for context, she's actually stuck without any power, and actually she pointed this out in a text message to me as ironic, given the topic for today. And the fact that, I think Rana made a comment earlier in the chat to say that renewables are the more stable solution. So I think it's ironic given that, but nonetheless, I'm just going to share a few slides with you, and then hopefully this gives you a little bit of context to what Natasha was going to say. It's titled People First Approach to an Energy and Sustainable Development. One of the things that I did want to, maybe, is this moving? Can you see my slides by any chance?
See it? Shall I?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just going to go with the faith that you can actually see my slides and say I put down a little bit on who is Natasha Allen based on her speaker bio. So she's a solar engineer dedicated to community-driven approaches with basically electricity access and governance. She started Mi Panyar, which is a Myanmar-based social enterprise that provides training and operational support. So to basically operate and maintain rural power systems. And she's had a lot of experience working across Cambodia, Myanmar, Tanzania, Uganda. And so, yeah, I think she was quite well placed to make this presentation today. What I found interesting through her slides, and please bear with me, this is literally just looking at her slides and imagining what she might have said, but it is that I think energy underpins everything that we do. That it's kind of like or I like how she called it the first harmonic of development. So, talking about basically the success of SDG 7 affects humanity's ability to realize many things. And I think this is a narrative that all of us are, or most of us are quite in line with or in tune with. One of the things that I found interesting with her presentation was what she talked about as focal narratives, which were in the energy access space, and then which are lower priority, but actually should probably be included. So this was something that I found really interesting. It came down to those. So when we look at all of these, I think what she was trying to say was that these require techno, but also socioeconomic solutions. And then, that interventions cannot be sustainable for people nor planet if we don't have these techno socioeconomic solutions. And well, more finally, I think, the ambitions we need to cultivate. And I think what I liked at the end was when she said, the goal of development work is to make the development industry redundant. I wonder what she wanted to actually say with this, but I'm going to leave it here and say that we're going to certainly make sure that we can bring her in as a voice for a future rendezvous and actually get to hear with her and converse with her on the specifics of her work. So that's it from me. And yeah, thank you, Rebecca, again, and everybody to having me here.
Bibu, thank you for bravely stepping in and just covering off those few points to help participants just get a flavour of what Natasha was going to cover. At this point, I would like to ask Claire and Molin to turn on their cameras and their microphones. Welcome back to you both. It's great to have you here. The way this is going to run for the next 15-20 minutes is as follows. We have a number of questions in the Q&A for our speakers, and I'm going to kick off with asking a couple of those, and then we're also going to be inviting a number of you who'd like to ask them from the floor as well to join us. You'll be invited up. If you want to do that, please remember to raise your hand. We do only have sort of 15-20 minutes though, so please bear with us because I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions today. But what I'd like to do is kick off with the first one actually in the Q&A, and to you, Claire, in particular, because it says World Bank. You know, is this a fits-all approach for countries, and to what are these solutions, and what does that situation?
So indeed, the idea of the SRMI is a one-size-fits-all country, but we are completely mindful of the fact that countries don't have the same regulatory environment, the same. They are more or less also advanced in terms of the power sector development. So the one size fits all doesn't mean that you have to apply the 4 blocks to all countries, but you can just pick and choose what is needed. For example, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Namibia, Botswana, they have a very strong planning capacity. They already have generation and transmission plans, so they don't need us or our partners to help them with that. They will maybe need some technical assistance for the procurement part, for just loans to finance the critical public infrastructure. So it's really like a pick and choose approach, but in a one size fits all, let's say, program. And also, I see questions on industry versus households and so on. So we are working most of the time with the utilities, and the utility serves both the industrial customers and the households and small businesses. So we don't have a specific focus on residential versus industrial businesses or customers. And also sometimes we work directly with, for example, in Burkina Faso, we worked both with the utilities and one of the mine that needed a new generation. So it really depends on the country with whom we are working to try to adapt and tailor the approach so that it will be as useful as possible.
Thank you, Claire, for that response. One thing that I should say is that we're going to have some informal networking at the end. So maybe if there's some follow-on discussion from any of the answers that our presenters give, maybe you have a chance to approach them in the informal networking as well, just to pick their brains a bit more. So at this point, what I'd like to do is invite Stefan Singer up to the stage, and I believe Stefan has a question for you both. If Stefan could join us and turn on his microphone, that would be great. Just give a few to see. Okay, so it would appear that Stefan has had to jump. At this point, what I'm going to do is just ask if any participants who'd like to raise their hand to come up to the stage to question. But I do have a question here for Moline, for you, and that I know that you are quite keen to answer as well. So, oh, hello, Jürgen. It's lovely to see you.
Hi.
Hi, Jürgen. So I'm going to hold that question for you, Moline, and I'm going to jump to Jürgen quickly and just say, Jürgen, welcome. What would you like to share your question succinctly, please, with Claire and Moline?
One question regarding, what I recognize, we are in renewable development, and we recognize right now, since renewables really become commercially viable, it seems that the big boys take over. So there is huge investment going on, and that will further scale up massively in the near future. What I would ask to World Bank, there is a need really to build up common capital, people's capital, which don't have or have very limited capital. This opportunity now with the energy transition is a huge opportunity to build up this common capital, like, for example, what Norway is doing with the national fund. And Norway is investing massively for the country, for the people, into renewables. Can we replicate that under the lead, for example, of World Bank? And incorporate those mechanisms into renewable development here in the future. So otherwise, we have just built up of capital and huge pull out of profits and returns to very few people and few investors, and really the public, the masses, the people are not really profiting from that.
So I would say, and I guess it's also related to another questions that I saw on why we're focusing in this under SRMA on private sector investment and development. And the question, I mean, the answer is quite simple: is that there is not enough capital available from the public side to invest in,
that's the
massive amounts. Yeah, but I mean, we cannot. So we are providing some capital and to our client countries, but we cannot create more capital than
is created through the projects. Capital will be built up through the returns. You finance a project only through maybe very limited in equity, which is maybe limited to 20–30%. The rest is coming anyway from other bank finance.
So that's what we're trying to do, ensuring that whatever project that will be built in a country will bring as many benefits, local benefits, and will improve the participation to the country, to the value chain, to the local value chain. And also one important thing to notice is that when we build new RE plants under good procurement processes and so on, we ensure that the cost of electricity will go down as much as possible. And so this will directly benefit the citizens, because currently in many sub-Saharan Africa, the generation cost is more than 15 cents per kilowatt hour. And we're talking about projects with PPAs that will be around 4 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So there is already a direct impact on development, which is very, very important. And with SRMI, the idea is to not limit the impact on the generation costs, but also on the job creation, creating when we can, I mean, not when we can, but when it is possible, a real, value chain in the country, ensuring that new companies will be created, and that over the long term, like Vietnam did, they have a huge supply chain of solar panels. The wealth will go back to the country and not to international leaders.
Thank you, Jürgen, very much for asking the question and being bold and brave, and the first one to step up to the platform. And at this point, I do have a question which has come through the Q&A function, which I believe you would like to answer, Molin, from your perspective. So the question is, despite the barriers to renewable energy deployment in emerging economies, I understand that Kenya is already largely dependent on renewable energy. Is this correct? And how did they overcome these barriers? Yeah. So Molin, would you like to jump in?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's a great question. And yeah, it is true. Kenya is 70% of the country's electricity comes from renewable energy. And one of the ways that they reached this point was around 2010, 2011, we came up together. The government actually contracted a group of us who came in and helped the country to draft the national energy policy, and more specifically with for renewable energy technologies. And part of that, the main thing that the government of Kenya had wanted us to do was to be able to set up a framework that will help them to work through the next 20 years to be able to bring the country to a point where they'll be 100% dependent on renewable energy technologies by 2020. But we see 2020 already passed, but the country is not where it wants to be, but it's well on its way there. And you see, one of the, other than the policy that we drafted for them, another thing, we had support, like goodwill from the government. And goodwill, I cannot emphasize how that is quite necessary for any the success of any renewable energy policy or any policy in general, because without the government support, government coming on board, then it becomes quite futile to try and push the country to that direction. But so in as much as they've overcome some of the barriers, they're still having a huge challenge if they're sort of like to be able to reach their 100% target that they want. For instance, being able to overcome the issue of monopolization of renewable energy technologies, that's a big problem. Then the issue of being able to decentralize funds within I think now they have the county governments, so that development is not only within the national level, but it also goes within the grassroots level.
For your comprehensive answer there, and I'm just wondering if I can't see any more hands up at this point in time, but if you would like to ask a question, please do feel free to raise your hand. I know that we have Gwamaka who would like to come up to the stage as well and ask a quick question. So Gwamaka, if you're there, do feel free to turn your camera and microphone on and join us. Here he comes.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome, Gwamaka. Yeah.
I was just typing my question out in the Q&A. So mine is one that I've had quite a few times, because one of the attractions we see with fossil fuel, and in particular with natural gas for various additional reasons, is that their projects create a lot of direct and indirect employment for a long period of time, and that works in particularly politicians' favors. For, you know, it looks like development and it can create a lot of jobs for low-skilled workers, which unfortunately vast majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa in particular still are. So my question is really, how can renewable energy provide a solution on that front, where it's not so much about the energy, but the project around it, all the jobs that are created, whether that's cooking meals for welders and so on, instead of this leapfrogging. And just a little bit of context, for a lot of Africa, industrialization is not so much about productivity, although that's important. It's really about job creation to absorb this growing population. So a lot happening all at once. And my question was kind of to everyone, you know, when you go beyond energy, what does renewables offer by the way of solutions that also tackle these other developmental problems? Thank you.
Who wants to jump in here and sort of respond to Gwamaka's point? And either of you want to jump in at this point?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Claire.
Okay. So I'll start. Thank you, Molin. So I guess, so unfortunately, my colleague who is really like the specialist in that was not able to join. So I'm stepping in her shoes, and I'll give the examples that I have. But like, for example, for the Botswana analysis that they performed very recently, they were able to show that those projects would create not lots, but a substantial amount of jobs. I think like more than, I don't want to say something silly, but 1,000 jobs just by like during the development phase and the construction, and that so that could take for like more than 4 or 5 years, particularly for the CSP and the wind plants, and that those jobs would remain. So not the 1,000, but at least like I think a third of the jobs will still be necessary after the plant is being built, to particularly for the CSP and wind farms that are more job intensive in terms of operations and maintenance. And so that like creating building those wind farm CSP plants or PV farm would lead to some like job creation locally, and sometimes jobs that necessitate some skills. And that the good thing was that with the time that the building the plants will take, there is some time to transfer or to build the capacity, particularly of like miners, because Botswana has a very large mining industry. And so to work with miners to transfer some of their skills and ensure that they will be able to work on the CSP plant, for example. Molin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. The way what I'd say is that renewable energy technologies already, I think they can rival fossil fuels in terms of the projects that they have. And I say this primarily because of the experiences I've seen in Kenya, South Africa, and Liberia. Allow me to use the example of Kenya again, in the sense that in terms of like renewable energy technologies within the East African, success rate is slightly better than some of its neighbors. So for instance, in Kenya, they have the geothermal project in Naivasha and the wind farm in Turkana. And you find since they started the wind farm project in Turkana, the particular community, which is largely nomadic, had been able to be recruited into, for instance, the some of the sort of like to do the menial jobs, which is it's not pretty, but at least it has sort of like boosted that community in the sense that there's so much development within the last 5 years in that particular area prior to many years before such projects came into place. For example, Johannesburg and they have this PV sort of like, I want to say farms for lack of a better word. And you have most of the young men who are probably finished school and are not able to get jobs. They are able to sort of like create their own shops where they're selling solar panels and all that. But the ideal situation would be for the countries to come to a point where they can actually be manufacturing this as opposed to importing, because from what I've seen, they're still importing that. So there's not that local ownership in terms of like manufacturing and generation of it. But in terms of like job creation, it's there, but it's not to the scale where the fossil fuel are currently at, but we can get there essentially.
Thank you so much both for your responses. It's interesting. We've had a number of hands raised, and thank you so much to those who have stepped up. I think you may forgive us. We might run over just by a couple of minutes, but we really would like Ripu Banjan to come up to the stage and ask his question. Proceedings to more networking.
Not really a question. Thanks, Rebecca. I think I just wanted to comment, if I'm allowed to. I'll just take a couple of minutes from India. And I wanted to share that I think relevance to the topic renewables for sustainable development. I think more emphasis, and I'll just narrow it down, that we want to see from the women in particular within renewables to not just contribute at sustainable development, but also to accelerate and advance the sustainable development via renewables. And I'll share a crude example from my visit to one of the rural India villages here back. It's been almost now, and I share that completely, that once we were doing the implementation, we distributed renewable energy resources, the DRE, and we invited women and girls basically to look after the maintenance of the solar charging stations that we were putting up in the electrified villages, which didn't have electricity, but they were only dependent on kerosene, and also looking after the solar lanterns that we one of the programs while I was at Terry working with Dr. Pichari at that time. So we saw a lot of girls in their teenage, they came forward and contributed in managing the operations and maintaining that solar charging station, which provided 50 lanterns, solar lanterns to the villages, right? And now it's been a decade. What it did, the lanterns may not be working now, and I can be honest. I mean, it was 10 years back, and they had their shelf life, and all of that is gone. But what it did change the lives of those girls is it provided them and it empowered them to become leaders in that particular segment of, let's say, 50 or 25 households. So they felt that they can also lead and not just be a part of some particular village. They're just sitting in a kitchen and doing some cooking work. So that's what the confidence that builds charging stations built within those girls, and they came out of those shells and they tried to do something for their own. They came out in the, not just the village, but they came out in the rural, the urban city. They tried to do something different. And now when we hear the stories, I'm no more with Terry, but I'm still connected with those village entrepreneurs, the local level entrepreneurs, and I do hear that those girls, which started off with maintaining the solar charging stations, they have now come to the big cities, the cities of the district, the cities of the states, and they are trying to do something for themselves. I mean, doing great work in terms of doing the village level entrepreneurship and rural level entrepreneurship, maybe at the state level, and maybe supporting not just to 1, 2, but maybe 10 or 15 villages. And they have become entrepreneurs, clean energy entrepreneurs. I think these are the stories that one needs to bring out in the open and see how we can, the renewables can really change and contribute to sustainable development. That's it from me. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so
And
much,
thanks for
Rippy,
Vibhu
for
to invite
sharing
me
that.
here.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's very powerful. So at this point, I would like to invite Rana to turn her camera and microphone on and join us on stage. I think she a couple of things that she just wanted to discuss with our panelists before we wrap up for today. We move into the final proceedings.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both, and thanks to all for the questions and the chat, which was full of great examples. And thanks, Ripu, I think, for sharing your, this example from India, because I think it's this is basically one of the questions which I would like to ask to both of you. I mean, I think you spoke about the fact, we heard you speaking about the fact that it's about development. Development is not only the energy sector. We see that energy has a key role for many other sectors. It also has a key role for, as we heard from India, but also Molid, I think you touched upon this, and Wim has put something into the chat for community building, for governance, for how people operate together and create their own societal and economic systems. And I think this is what I would like to ask both of you is players who need to be involved here are not only the energy players. How can we, so what are your experiences? What are you doing? Who are your counterparts beyond the energy players in your activities? And how can we ensure that these are strategically and systematically included in the discussions and in the developments, in policies, etc., in investment, in implementation?
And just share your thoughts with Rana.
Maybe Molin can go first this time.
Thank you, Rana, for your question. So I'd say I'm a big believer in being able to break down the silo sort of like mindset when it comes to the conversations that we are having within the renewable sector. And I think it's quite a good thing to sort of like have a more cross-sectoral approach when you're talking about the renewable energy technologies and how that relates with sustainable development, because for years what we've had is policy is developed within the confines of a particular sector at the expense of other sectors, such for instance health, education, and whatnot. So by the time, for instance, a policy is being put in place, all these other sectors that would actually benefit or had an impact in this particular policy initiative that's being fronted are at a loss, and the policy dies before it even sees the light of day. So I think being able to break down those silos sort of like mindset when it comes to this conversation is really, really critical if we are to move to the next stage, such that the stakeholders that we are bringing on board are not just people within the community, but also people within the academia, the R&D, most importantly, the grassroots level, the people within the various communities that we are working with, because they are the people who evidently have to have ownership of these projects and ownership of the processes that we are trying to put in place. Yeah, Claire?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Moline just said. I think, and once again, it relates to what I said earlier. It's we don't have the same interlocutors in the various countries. So obviously, energy ministry, the utilities, the renewable energy agency, the sometimes like rural renewable energy agencies are our counterparts. But we also discuss and talk a lot with local communities to understand what their needs are. In Indonesia, for example, we are also working with the Ministry of Villages and with the Ministry of Fisheries, because they do have a need for cooling, and so for energy for cooling. So we're really working with local actors that need the energy and that will benefit from the energy, but that could also contribute to the supply chain, to jobs, to jobs and so on. So really it depends, and it depends of the structure of the local communities and of the jobs, the access to these local communities, if it's like maritime access, road access. So depending on that, we can also like discuss with the Ministry of Transport. So it's really a large community of actors, and not indeed just the energy ministry. And obviously, when there is like a ministry working on climate change, this ministry is also involved. So yeah, very large community and diversity of actors.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if you could allow a quick follow-up question, especially to you, Claire, because I think the World Bank is basically with a program and with these partners also to some extent in the center. To what extent do you have non-energy ministries strategically reaching out to you to make sure that the energy supply is reliable, secure, etc. in countries? To really, because I think there is really this part of energy as an enabler, and there was lots of discussion about the co-benefits of energy. But what if actually there was another benefit which was higher in the hierarchy and would allow us to accelerate basically the decisions and investment in renewable energy? And we continue to see it from the energy side.
I mean, I'm not sure I have, except like the Ministry of Fisheries, with whom we are like closely working in Indonesia to accelerate and enable the electrification of remote islands, but with lots of fishery potential. I mean, there is a need for agriculture, for pumping, for milling. So like my colleagues working on productive uses have much more like relationships with the agriculture like sector than I do. To be like honest, I mostly work on grids, so less on the access part. But yeah, I would say agriculture, fisheries are two ministries with whom we are regularly in contact.
Okay, great. So I don't know, Rebecca, you're looking at me. I think it's a time to wrap up.
I think it might be time to wrap. This is the problem, isn't it? We could just talk for hours, and but we're really trying to stick to the timing to respect all your diaries. So, but it's great to see the enthusiasm in the chat. There's some great sharing going on. There's some great resource and connections happening. And so, at this point, Rana, I just really want to sort of, first of all, I think you're going to thank our panelists, aren't you? And I also want to put my thanks to that as well. It's been a really great session, and just ask you the question around your sort of key observations as well from today's session, kind of the key insight, maybe one key insight, Rana, that you'd like to share.
Wow, one key insight. Okay, one key insight is this discussion can only start because it needs to be continued. Let's say it like this. I think there is lots of questions, and I also think like what I find interesting, and so what Guamaka also brought in this part of energy at the center, but maybe we need to look actually much broader to accelerate the development of renewable energy capacities by bringing in other voices in the driving seat, I guess. It's not in a consultative process, but basically to look at energy from their angle. And this is for me a real question, which is there also with regard to the fact, I think, on the part of finance. And one thing is clear, I just want to underline, because yes, access to finance seems to be there. It's about bankable projects. This means like the right policy and regulatory frameworks. So the governments have a key role to play here, but the reality is also some governments do not play this role. So how can we, and this directly hampers the development of renewable energy, how can we basically ensure that maybe other players who have an interest in good and stable regulatory frameworks can put this pressure on the governments? I think this is always this question of allies. Are there allies out there we don't connect with enough? I think, Malin, you had spoken about the ecosystems and the silos, I think, silo thinking. I hear, Claire, that there are other partners also and other ministries, but if there may be possibilities to do this in a much more systematic way. And then the other part, I think, is this link, okay, one size fits all versus local realities. And I think looking at the local realities, as we heard very much okay, from the example of Kenya, but India, the last one also, create major opportunities to spread basically also the movement, the awareness, and bring other players on board. And also look at development in a broader context, and not only in the boundaries of energy projects, but much beyond this. And this might actually help to convince, I guess, decision makers who are rather critical and still look at, oh, fossil fuels still creates more jobs, to have another understanding and broadened understanding. I said that one key outcome is certainly we need to continue this discussion. I think we need better data on this. We need the stories. We need to tell the stories. We need to have the right people here to tell the stories, and not only to us, but also in the outside world. And as a result, I'm actually very happy to see that there is so much interest and engagement and questions and need to continue. Because from our side, we're going to have some regional discussions, so rendezvous style discussions. One which is starting next week, actually, on Southeast Asia, which will focus on from fossil fuel to renewables now, strategize energy transition in Southeast Asia. It's a start of a small project and pilot series. And I invite all of you to join. And I'm very, very happy that we'll have the opportunity to start a discussion on the role of renewable energy in Africa, how to position basically renewables in the context of energy for growth and development, because there is a real need, I think, to have these exchanges and better understand what opportunities exist and how to accelerate change. Because the reality is, we have an increase of 2% investment. We would need to have an increase of 200% investment in renewable energy if we were about reaching Paris goals and the SDGs. So there is no time to think and not act. We clearly need the acceleration from everybody. And I thank everybody. I thank in particular Claire and Malin and Rebecca and Bibi for stepping in, and everybody participating. And I think we now have like a networking area, and please join us for these regional discussions coming up.